The dusty little town of Dry Creek lay quiet beneath the golden glow of a setting sun. Wooden storefronts leaned tiredly against one another, their paint flaking after years of hard weather, while the air carried the mixed scents of leather, smoke, and horses. Life moved slower here, but tongues moved quick. By dusk, every porch rocker and saloon bench hummed with talk, laughter, and the occasional cruel jest whispered just to see how far it would travel. Folks here loved their stories, and if there weren't any worth telling, they made their own. That evening, one such tale began one that would ripple through the prairie for years to come. It started with a joke. The sort of mean-spirited prank that men in their cups often considered clever. The townsfolk had chosen their target, a rancher who lived on the outskirts of Dry Creek. He was steady and quiet, the type who kept to himself, working his cattle and rarely giving the gossips any fuel for their fires. That silence, however, made him a favorite subject, for people often mocked what they could not understand. He was strong, broad-shouldered, and wealthier than most, yet they painted him as lonely, strange, unfit for the company of good folk. And so, when the idea took root to embarrass him in front of the whole town, it grew faster than weeds after a summer rain. Word passed quietly among a few, then spread louder with each chuckle and nod. By the time the plan had fully formed, nearly everyone in Dry Creek seemed to know, save the man himself. The joke was simple. 5 women, all striking in their own way, would be sold to him under the guise of a transaction, like cattle at the stockyard. It was to be humiliating, showing him as a man so desperate for company that he'd take whatever was handed to him. The thought of it sent the men howling with laughter in the saloon, mugs sloshing with beer, while a few of the women folk hid their disapproval behind tight lips and wary eyes. The chosen women were not random. Each carried her own story, her own reasons for being tangled in such a cruel trick. One was known for her sharp wit that cut deeper than a blade, another for her quiet strength in tending to her family after tragedy. A third carried beauty that men often praised but never respected, while the fourth bore the scars of broken promises and false starts. The fifth, youngest of them, still carried a hope that the world might hold more than dusty roads and small-town whispers. None of them expected to find themselves at the heart of a spectacle, yet the fates of all 5 were bound together that day. When the rancher entered town that morning, the air seemed different, thick with expectation. Folks leaned from windows and lingered near storefronts as though waiting for a parade. He walked with the same steady stride as always, boots clapping against the wood-planked walkways, his hat tilted low against the sun. He had no idea eyes followed his every step. He had no notion that behind the laughter echoing from the saloon, behind the hushed conversations in the mercantile, his life was about to be turned upside down. The sale was staged by men who thought themselves, clever papers drawn, witnesses gathered, a stage set for mockery. They expected shock on his face, perhaps anger, perhaps shame. They wanted to see him break, to laugh at his expense for years to come. But the rancher was not a man easily rattled. He stood tall as the women were brought forward, each one lined up like a prize to be displayed, though none of them had agreed willingly to this twisted game. The townsfolk waited. A hush fell over Dry Creek as the moment hung in the air. Would he storm off, red with fury? Would he lash out, proving their whispers of his temper true? Would he refuse, leaving the women humiliated alongside him? That was the entertainment. They had come for the unraveling of a man they had long misunderstood. Instead, what followed was something no one had predicted. He stepped closer, looking each woman in the eye, not with pity nor anger, but with a quiet resolve. The silence stretched thin, the crowd holding its breath. Then, in a voice calm as a still river, he spoke words that froze them where they stood. He did not reject the bargain. He did not fight the terms. He did not play the fool as they had hoped. Instead, he declared that he would take each of these women not as property, not as a joke, but as his wives. The gasps that followed rippled through the town like thunder. Laughter died in throats, replaced by shock and uneasy silence. No one had considered this outcome. No one had thought the rancher would turn their cruel trick into something bold, something binding. The women themselves stood stunned, torn between disbelief and the strange flicker of possibility that sparked in their hearts. Could it be true? Could he mean it? The preacher, summoned only to add weight to the joke, found himself caught in the middle of something that now carried an air of destiny. With trembling hands he opened his book, his voice quivering as he read the words that joined one soul to another. And one by one, before the stunned eyes of Dry Creek, the rancher spoke his vows not with flowery language or showmanship, but with the simple steadiness of a man who knew his mind. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, the deed was done. The 5 women who had been brought forward as pawns in a cruel jest now stood as brides. The rancher, once mocked for his solitude, had answered the laughter of the town with an act so bold, so unexpected, that no one dared to laugh anymore. Yet, behind the awe and the whispers, tension lingered like storm clouds on the horizon. No one knew what this new union would bring. Would the women accept this fate? Would the rancher prove himself worthy of so many hearts at once? Would the town, once united in ridicule, now turn divided in judgment? The future hung heavy with questions, and as the newly bound household left the town behind, a chill settled over the onlookers. The joke was over, but the story had only just begun, and somewhere in that fading light, in the space between duty and choice, between bitterness and hope, lay a truth that none of them yet understood. What began as cruelty might yet grow into something the town of Dry Creek would never forget. The road ahead was uncertain. The laughter had turned to silence. The rancher's boldness had rewritten the jest. But whether this tale would end in triumph or tragedy was a secret the prairie wind carried away, leaving only questions and the promise of a storm yet to come. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when the wagon creaked its way out of Dry Creek, carrying the rancher and the 5 women who now bore his name. The townsfolk lingered behind, their voices hushed, their minds unsettled by what they had just witnessed. Whispers would fly for weeks, but in that moment the little town was struck dumb, watching the dust rise behind the wagon wheels as though they had seen a ghost pass. The cruel jest that was supposed to make fools of others had instead unsettled the very ground they walked on. The road stretched long and lonely, winding through prairie grass and patches of cottonwood trees. The rancher held the reins steady, his eyes fixed on the horizon as though he could already see the land he called home. Behind him, the 5 women sat close, their dresses brushing against one another, their thoughts tangled in silence. The air between them was thick with questions unspoken, each of them trying to reckon with what had just taken place. The eldest among them, sharp-eyed and proud, sat with her arms crossed. She had been no stranger to hardship, and her spirit was not easily bent. She looked at the rancher's broad back with suspicion, wondering what kind of man would so calmly turn a humiliation into marriage. The second, quieter and more thoughtful, kept her gaze on the land rolling by, her hands folded tight in her lap. She had lost much in her life already, and this strange turn of events left her wondering whether fate had dealt her another cruel hand or something she could not yet name. The third woman, whose beauty had always drawn the wrong sort of attention, sat with her chin lifted high. She had been treated like a prize too many times before, and she did not care to play that part again. Yet there was something different in the way the rancher had looked at her, not with hunger, not with mockery, but with a quiet steadiness that unsettled her more than she wished to admit. The fourth, with eyes that carried old sorrow, said little. Her hands trembled faintly, though she tried to hide it. She was used to being disappointed, And she feared this was another chapter in a story that never seemed to change. The youngest, her cheeks still round with traces of youth, sat wide-eyed, her heart pounding. She had dreamed of escape, of something beyond the confines of Dry Creek's wagging tongues and narrow streets. She did not know if this was deliverance or disaster, but she could not stop the flicker of hope that stirred within her. For the first time, she felt the world was shifting, and she was caught in its turning. The rancher remained silent for most of the journey, his jaw set, his thoughts his own. He was no fool. He knew the town had meant to make a mockery of him. He had seen their smirks, heard their whispers. But he was not a man who bowed to cruelty. He had turned their laughter back on them, and in doing so, he had changed the course of his life and the lives of the 5 women beside him. What weighed on him now was not whether he had done the right thing, but how he would carry the burden he had chosen. The ranch itself rose like a shadow out of the fading light, its weathered fences stretching wide, the big barn standing tall against the prairie sky. The house, simple yet sturdy, sat on a hill overlooking the land. To the women, it seemed both. Lonely and vast, a place of both refuge and uncertainty. As the wagon rolled to a stop, the rancher stepped down, his boots crunching against the dry earth. He offered a hand to each of them, his movements calm, as though this were no stranger than any other day. Inside, the house was quiet, the air heavy with the smell of pine wood and the faint lingering of tobacco. There were no fine furnishings, only what was needed: a large hearth, sturdy chairs, shelves filled with books worn at the edges, and a long table that looked as though it had been carved by his own hands. The women exchanged glances, some uneasy, some curious. They were not welcomed into a place of extravagance, but neither was it barren or cold. It was a working man's home, shaped by steady labor and solitude. As night settled in, they gathered in the main room, the fire crackling as the prairie wind howled against the walls. For the first time, the silence broke. The eldest spoke sharply, demanding to know what he expected of them. Her voice carried the bite of someone unwilling to be made a fool again. The rancher looked at her evenly, his voice steady when he answered. He told them he expected nothing they were unwilling to give. He had not taken them as property. He had taken them as wives, and while the world might not understand, it was not the world's judgment he cared for. His words did not soothe them, but neither did they ring false. The women exchanged uncertain glances, each wrestling with their own thoughts. Some felt anger, others suspicion, and one or two felt the faintest glimmer of something else possibility. Yet the tension remained, pressing down on them like the weight of the storm that rolled in outside. Lightning flashing across the distant plains. Over the days that followed, life at the ranch began to take its shape. The women were strangers to one another, yet now bound under the same roof, their paths intertwined. There were chores to be shared, meals to be made, and long hours where silence stretched too wide. Each one carried her own burdens, her own secrets, her own sense of what had been lost or stolen from her. Trust was not easily given, and the house often echoed with the unspoken questions that hung heavy in the air. The town did not forget. Whispers carried across Dry Creek like wildfire. Some said the rancher had gone mad. Others said the women had bewitched him. There were those who laughed still, though their laughter carried unease now. And there were some who watched with keen eyes, waiting to see what would become of this strange union. The rancher's boldness had unsettled the order of things, and people do not forgive easily when their certainty is shaken. The women themselves were not blind to the stares when they ventured into town. They felt the weight of judgment on their backs, the sneers, the pity, the curiosity. They knew they were part of something that set them apart, something the world would not easily accept. Some bore it with defiance, others with quiet endurance. But none escaped the sting of being marked as different, and yet behind the unease, something began to stir. The rancher's land was vast and demanding, and he worked it with tireless devotion. He did not treat them as burdens, nor as trophies. He treated them as people, each with worth, each with strength. His silence often left them guessing at his thoughts, but his actions spoke louder than any words. When the eldest cut her hand on a broken tool, he bound it with care. When the quiet one wept in the dark, thinking no one heard, he left a lantern burning near her door. Small acts, unnoticed by some, but heavy with meaning to those who saw. Still, the tension did not vanish. Rivalry sparked between the women, each uncertain of her place. Some nights the air at the dinner table grew thick with unspoken conflict. Some days the chores turned into contests rather than cooperation. They were 5 souls bound together not by choice but by circumstance, and the road to understanding was not easily walked. And through it all, the rancher remained steady, his eyes ever fixed on the horizon, as though he could see what none of them yet could. There was something in him the women did not fully grasp, something unspoken that lingered behind his calm gaze. He had not explained why he had accepted them. Why he had turned a cruel jest into a vow. That mystery weighed heavier with each passing day, for the answer lay somewhere in the silence between them. The prairie wind carried secrets, and in the stillness of the ranch at night, each woman wondered what lay ahead. They had been thrust into a future none of them chose, yet something told them this story was far from over. The storm clouds that gathered on the horizon were not only of weather, but of fate. And as the days passed, each heart began to realize that the cruel joke played in Dry Creek had only been the opening of a tale far larger, far darker, and far more dangerous than anyone had yet imagined. The ranch stood quiet under the wide sky, but within its walls, questions grew like shadows. None of them knew whether this bond would bring ruin or redemption. But they all felt it, the uneasy promise of something waiting just beyond the edge of sight. The story of Dry Creek was still being written, and the next page would demand more than any of them had ever given before. The nights at the ranch grew long and restless. The prairie wind carried with it the sound of coyotes, and the timbers of the house creaked as though the land itself whispered warnings. Each of the 5 women lay awake in her own way, staring into the shadows, wondering what tomorrow would demand. Though they shared the same roof, their hearts remained guarded, each one locked behind doors not easily opened. The rancher's presence, calm, steady, and unreadable, was both a comfort and a mystery. His silence left too much room for doubt, and doubt grew quickly in lonely hours. The eldest of the women, with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, often watched him the closest. She had lived long enough to know that a man's actions spoke louder than any oath. Though he treated them with respect, she could not shake her suspicion. She wanted to know his true reasons. Did he take them out of pity, defiance, or some hidden plan he had yet to reveal? She kept her questions close, but her gaze followed him from the fields to the barn, waiting for the slip that would expose the truth. The second woman, quiet by nature, spent more time with the land itself. She helped tend the garden, fed the chickens, and found small comfort in the rhythm of work. Yet inside she carried the weight of loss, and the strangeness of her new life pressed down heavy. She began to wonder if this place might allow her to start again, or if it would simply add another chapter of sorrow to her already burdened soul. Sometimes at dusk she lingered by the corral, speaking softly to the horses as if they might understand what her heart could not say aloud. The third, proud and beautiful, had little patience for the arrangement. She had grown tired of being seen as an ornament, and though the rancher's gaze did not carry the same hunger she had endured from others, she mistrusted it all the same. She held her head high at the dinner table, spoke little, and challenged any of the others who dared cross her. Beneath her defiance, though, was a fear she would not admit, that perhaps this was her fate, to be bound in a way that stole her freedom no matter how many times she tried to grasp it back. The fourth, marked by sorrow and silence, seemed almost ghost-like in the house. She moved gently, spoke rarely, and carried a shadow in her eyes that unsettled the others. She did her work without complaint, yet her presence felt like a question no one dared to ask. Sometimes at night she sat by the window, staring out at the endless dark of the prairie as if expecting something or someone to appear. What haunted her was her own, but its weight seeped into the walls, and the others felt it even when they did not know its name. The youngest still looked upon the ranch with wide-eyed wonder. To her, the vastness of the land was freedom, and the quiet strength of the rancher stirred hope she did not fully understand, but she was also restless. She wandered further than the others, walking the fences, climbing the hills, peering out toward the horizon as though chasing something she had only dreamed of. Her curiosity made her reckless, and though she meant no harm, she often stirred unease among the others, who feared she did not grasp the danger of such untamed country. Inside the house, tensions rose like heat in summer. The women were not rivals in name, yet they could not help but measure one another. Each wondered about her own place in the rancher's eyes. Did he favor one above the rest? Did he expect devotion from them, or did he mean his words when he said he demanded nothing? Meals became quiet battles, with glances exchanged like sharp blades. Chores turned into contests, each trying to prove her worth, her strength, or her independence. And in the center of it all, the rancher carried on with the same steady rhythm, neither fueling nor soothing the storm brewing under his roof. Beyond the walls of the ranch, the town of Dry Creek had not forgotten. Whispers grew into rumors, and rumors hardened into judgments. Some claimed the women were trapped, forced into a life they had not chosen. Others suggested they had conspired, their marriage a scheme for the rancher's wealth. There were men who still laughed at the joke gone wrong, and others who seethed with resentment, jealous of what the rancher now had. The saloon, once filled with harmless banter, began to echo with talk of scandal and vengeance. It was not long before trouble began to creep closer. One evening, as the eldest carried a bucket of water from the well, she noticed tracks near the fence boot prints, too fresh to be her own or the rancher's. A gate had been left open, though she knew it had been latched that morning. A calf was missing, its bleeding mother pacing near the fence line. She said nothing at first, but her sharp eyes caught the rancher's when he returned. He said little, only gave a single nod, but his jaw tightened. Someone had been there. The following week, the youngest wandered further than she should have, chasing after a stray horse near the creek. She returned pale and shaken, her dress torn at the hem. She spoke of voices in the brush, of laughter that did not sound friendly. The others scolded her for her carelessness, but deep down they all felt the same dread. The town's anger, once spoken only in whispers, was beginning to press against the edges of their lives. Inside the house, suspicion spread as well. The beautiful one accused the quiet one of trying to win the rancher's favor by stealing time alone with him. The sorrowful one was whispered about, as though her silence meant she carried secrets dangerous to them all. Even the youngest, once seen as innocent, was warned not to be so bold, lest she draw more trouble upon them. The eldest tried to command order, but her sharpness often cut deeper than she intended. What bound them together was not trust, but the fragile thread of circumstance. And that thread frayed a little more each day. The rancher himself grew more watchful. He spent longer hours patrolling the land, his rifle never far from reach. At night, he sat by the fire, silent as always, his eyes on the flames. The women longed for him to speak, to explain what lay heavy on his mind, but he offered them no answers. His silence became another wall they could not climb, another mystery they could not solve. The prairie, wide and endless, seemed to close in around them. Storms rolled in with sudden violence, lightning splitting the sky, rain lashing against the windows. Coyotes circled nearer at night, their cries haunting the dark. But it was not the beasts of the land they feared most. It was the creeping sense that the world beyond their fences would not let them be. The cruel joke that had brought them together had not ended with vows. It had only planted seeds of conflict, jealousy, and danger that now began to grow. One evening, as the fire burned low, the eldest broke the silence with words none could ignore. She said aloud what they all feared, that their union had painted a target on the ranch, and that the town would not rest until it saw them broken. Her words hung heavy, and though no one dared answer, each woman felt the truth of them in her bones. The rancher said nothing, only stared into the fire, but his hand gripped the arm of his chair until the wood creaked. The women lay awake again that night, each lost in her own thoughts. The quiet one prayed for peace, the beautiful one plotted her own defense, the sorrowful one clutched at the memories she could not escape, the youngest dreamed of freedom, and the eldest kept her watchful eyes open long after the rest had closed. Theirs. Suspicion, longing, and fear twined together until they could no longer tell one from the other. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it the promise of change. Whether it would bring ruin or something else, none could yet say. But deep within, each of them knew the same truth, that the storm gathering around them was no longer a matter of chance. It was only a matter of time. The ranch fell into a rhythm that was anything but peaceful. Every sunrise brought work, and every night carried a silence heavy with unspoken fears. The women moved through their days, each carving her own place in the wide house, yet the air between them grew tighter, more strained. The eldest barked orders with a sharp tongue, trying to keep chaos at bay. The quiet one buried herself in chores, hoping routine would silence her doubts. The beautiful one remained distant, her pride a wall none dared cross. The sorrowful one slipped like a shadow through the halls, speaking so little that her presence seemed almost haunting. And the youngest wandered with restless steps, her eyes ever on the horizon, as though waiting for something or someone to appear. The rancher worked as he always had, his figure steady against the fields, his voice seldom raised, his thoughts locked away. But even his silence could not mask the changes. He carried his rifle more often now, not just for coyotes but for something less easy to name. The women saw the way he checked the fences, the way his eyes scanned the tree line, the way he lingered at the porch at dusk, his shoulders tense as if waiting. He never said it aloud, but all of them knew he was watching for trouble, and trouble was near. Word from Dry Creek traveled faster than the wind. The town had turned the ranch into a story, a scandal to gossip about by daylight, and a warning whispered after dark. Some said the women were tricking the rancher, using him for his land and cattle. Others spat that he had stolen them, binding them into shame. The saloon filled with talk of setting things right, though no one agreed what right meant. Jealousy festered in men who once courted the women, and bitterness stirred in others who resented the rancher's quiet defiance. It began with small things. Gates left open, tools missing, horses spooked in the night. The eldest found another set of boot prints near the barn, pressed deep in the mud after rain. The youngest swore she saw figures watching from the tree line at sunset, though by the time the rancher came, there was nothing but shadows. These signs were enough to set them all on edge, and the unease within the house only grew. At the dinner table, voices rose. The beautiful one accused the quiet one of sneaking favors from the rancher. The quiet one flushed with anger, denying it, though her words trembled. The eldest tried to silence them, but her tone was sharp enough to wound. The youngest, tired of being treated as foolish, snapped back with defiance. Even the sorrowful One, who rarely spoke, muttered a bitter remark that froze the room. The rancher sat at the head of the table, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. He did not shout, but the weight of his silence crushed the argument to an end. Yet the cracks remained. Each woman carried her grievances, her suspicions, her fears. Their unity was brittle, and the more they tried to hide it, the more the tension seeped into every word, every glance. The rancher's steadiness could not shield them from what brewed outside, nor could it mend what frayed within. The turning point came one night when the youngest, restless and curious, slipped out after dark. She wandered near the creek, drawn by the sound of voices carried on the wind. She crept low, her breath shallow, and saw them 3 men from town, faces she knew too well. They spoke in low tones, their laughter cruel, their words dripping with plans. They meant to make an example of the rancher, to drive him out, to scatter the women like cattle broken free of a pen. She did not wait to hear more, her heart pounding. She ran back to the house, her feet stumbling in the dark. When she burst through the door, breathless, the others gathered in alarm. Her words tumbled out, wild and frightened, but none could mistake the truth in her eyes. The eldest cursed under her breath, her sharp features hardening. The quiet one paled, her hands trembling. The beautiful one narrowed her gaze, suspicion flickering as though wondering whether the girl exaggerated. The sorrowful one only lowered her head, whispering something none could catch. The rancher listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When she finished, he nodded once, then rose from his chair. He fetched his rifle and set it against the wall by the door. His calm unsettled them more than anger might have. He did not promise safety, nor did he offer reassurance. He only said, "They must be ready, for the prairie did not forgive weakness, and neither would men who came with cruelty in their hearts." The days that followed dragged like heavy chains. Every noise beyond the fence made them jump. Every shadow on the horizon set their hearts racing. The eldest kept a sharp watch, her eyes scanning for signs. The quiet one prayed softly while working, though her prayers seemed swallowed by the silence of the land. The beautiful one polished a knife she kept hidden beneath her pillow. The sorrowful one moved slower, her sadness deeper, as though she already knew what would come. And the youngest, though frightened, carried a spark of defiance, refusing to cower when the others warned her to stay close. Then came the night when the storm broke. The sky grew dark with clouds, lightning tearing across the plains. Rain hammered the roof, and the wind howled like a beast at the door. Inside, the fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The rancher sat near the hearth, his rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the door. The women huddled close, each one silent, their breaths shallow as they listened to the storm and to the faint sound beneath it. Hooves, voices, men. The eldest gripped the arm of her chair, her knuckles white. The quiet one clutched a rosary she had strung together from beads and twine. The beautiful one stood by the window, peering out through the rain-streaked glass, her lips pressed tight. The sorrowful one closed her eyes, murmuring something too faint to hear. And the youngest clutched the rancher's sleeve, her wide eyes searching his face for any sign of fear. But he did not flinch. The voices grew louder, closer. Lantern light bobbed in the darkness beyond the fence. The horses in the barn whinnied in panic. A shout cut through the storm, rough and mocking. Then another and another, until the night was filled with the sound of men come to settle a score. The women turned to the rancher, their hearts racing. He rose slowly, the firelight glinting on the barrel of his rifle. His voice was low when he spoke, but it carried enough weight to silence the storm inside the house. He told them to stay together, to trust one another, to be stronger than the fear that gripped them. He did not promise they would win, only that they would not bow. Outside, the men drew nearer, their shouts rising above the wind. The first blow struck the fence, wood splintering. The second rattled the barn doors. The house itself seemed to tremble beneath the storm of voices and rain. Inside, hearts pounded, hands trembled, and the air grew thick with dread. The eldest reached for the kitchen knife, her jaw set. The quiet one sank to her knees, praying louder now, her words desperate. The beautiful one's eyes blazed, her pride turning to fury. The sorrowful one rose from her chair, her shadow stretching tall. Against the wall, her sorrow now sharp as steel. The youngest clung to the rancher, her fear burning into something fiercer, something that dared to stand unbroken. The storm outside and the storm within merged as one. The house was no longer just a shelter, it was a battlefield waiting for. The first strike, the cruel joke that had begun in Dry Creek, had reached its breaking point, and all that remained was the clash that everyone had feared and no one could stop. The rancher stepped toward the door. His hand gripped the handle. The women held their breath. The storm roared, and in that suspended moment, the world seemed to pause, balanced on the edge of a blade, waiting for the first cut. The storm outside did not wait for permission to break. The silence. The door shook beneath the pounding of fists, shouts rose above the wind, and lantern light cut through the rain in jagged streaks. The rancher stood with his hand on the door, his rifle ready, his jaw set as if carved from stone. Behind him, the 5 women huddled together, hearts hammering, each of them knowing that whatever happened next would decide not only their fate but the meaning of everything they had endured since that day in Dry Creek. The first crack came when a voice roared through the night, calling the rancher a fool, mocking his wives, daring him to come out and face them. Another voice followed, then another, until the sound of anger and resentment drowned out the storm itself. The women clutched at one another, each carrying her own fear, but for once not divided by suspicion or rivalry. In that moment, they were bound by the simple truth that they stood together against whatever darkness pressed in from outside. The rancher opened the door. Rain lashed across the porch, soaking his hat, lightning flashing in the distance. He stepped forward, rifle in hand, and faced the figures gathering near the fence. Their lanterns lit angry faces, shadows of men who had once shared drinks in the saloon, men who now came not with laughter but with cruelty. The rancher's voice cut through the night, calm yet carrying a weight that silenced them for a breath. He told them he would not bow, he would not surrender, and he would not cast aside the women who bore his name. The men jeered, some laughing, others shouting threats. They expected him to falter, to back down, but the steadiness in his eyes gave them pause. Behind him, the door creaked open wider, and to their surprise, the women stepped out onto the porch. The eldest held a knife in her hand, her face hard as steel. The quiet one stood tall, her hands clenched, no longer trembling. The beautiful one's pride shone like fire in her eyes. The sorrowful one carried herself with a strange strength, as though sorrow had turned to resolve. The youngest, defiant despite her fear, gripped a lantern high, casting light into the storm. The sight unsettled the crowd. This was not the broken household they had hoped to mock. This was not a man cowering with women forced into silence. This was something different, something they could not name, but something that stole their certainty. The rain beat harder, thunder shook the ground, and for a moment no one moved. Then came the breaking point. One of the men lunged forward, shouting, his anger louder than reason. The rancher raised his rifle, not firing, but steady enough to freeze the man mid-step. The eldest called out, her voice sharp as a whip, warning them to think twice before crossing a line they could not return from. The youngest stepped closer to the edge of the porch, lantern light spilling over the men, revealing their hesitation. The quiet one's voice rose in prayer, trembling yet fierce, carried by the storm. The beautiful one spoke next, her words laced with scorn. daring the men to test whether they could break what they had tried to turn into a joke. And the sorrowful one, her eyes shadowed yet unflinching, whispered words that none of them could hear clearly, but that seemed to chill the air itself. The men faltered. Their jeers grew quieter, their threats less certain. They had come expecting weakness, expecting a spectacle. Instead, they faced something they could not laugh away. The rancher did not flinch, the women did not retreat, and the storm itself seemed to stand with them, rain pouring harder, lightning splitting the sky as though the heavens bore witness. One by one, the men began to pull back. Their voices turned to mutters, their bravado melting beneath the steady gaze of the rancher and the unbroken line of women at his side. The first turned away, then another, until only a handful lingered, their anger still simmering but their courage gone thin. At last, even they lowered their lanterns, retreating into the dark, their silhouettes swallowed by the storm. When the last of them had gone, silence fell. The only sound was the rain, softer now, as though the land itself sighed in relief. The rancher lowered his rifle, his shoulders loosening. The women stood still, the lantern's flame flickering between them, their breaths heavy, their hearts still racing. They had faced the storm together, and though nothing was spoken, each of them knew something had shifted. The days that followed carried a new weight, but also a new bond. The town of Dry Creek remained restless, but word spread quickly of that night. Some mocked in hushed tones, others muttered with bitterness, but a quiet respect took root as well. Few dared to approach the ranch again. The cruel joke that had begun in the saloon had ended not in laughter, but in a story whispered with unease, a story of defiance, of unity, of a house no one could break. Within the ranch, the women began to find their place with clearer eyes. The eldest softened her sharpness, no longer needing to fight alone. The quiet one spoke more freely, her prayers now words of hope rather than despair. The beautiful one found herself less concerned with how others looked at her, her pride tempered into strength. The sorrowful one still carried her shadows, but they no longer weighed her down as before. She had stood firm when it mattered most, and the youngest, once restless, now walked the land with a sense of belonging, her lantern light still burning in her heart. The rancher remained much the same, steady, silent, unshaken, but something in his eyes carried a new light, a quiet acknowledgment of what they had all endured together. He had not explained his reasons on that first day, and perhaps he never would. But his actions had spoken louder than any words. He had taken what was meant to shame him and turned it into a vow, and together they had proved it was not a vow. Made in vain. As the seasons turned, the land answered with its own reflection. The fields grew strong, the cattle thrived, and the house became more than a shelter. It became a home. The women, once strangers bound by cruelty, grew into something closer to family. Their differences remained, their quarrels did not vanish, but beneath it all lay a bond that could not be denied. They had stood together on the porch that stormy night, and in doing so, they had carved out a place in a world that had tried to laugh them into ruin. The town still watched, still whispered, but with time, the story changed. What began as a cruel jest became a tale of resilience, one that even the most bitter tongues struggled to twist. Children in Dry Creek would one day hear of the 5 women who stood beside the rancher in the storm, and though not all would understand, many would feel a quiet awe. The joke had died that night, but something stronger had been born in its place, and so the ranch stood, steady against the horizon, its fences stretching wide, its fields golden in the sun. The women moved through their days, not as pawns in someone else's game, but as part of something they had chosen to shape together. The rancher, still quiet, still watchful, carried the same strength as always, but now it was shared, carried by all of them. The cruel laughter of Dry Creek had faded, replaced by silence. And in that silence lay respect, fear, and something neither the town nor the prairie could take away. For in the end, what had begun as a story of mockery became a story of defiance, of love found in the most unlikely of places, and of a house that weathered every storm, both from within and without. The wind still howled across the prairie. But inside the ranch there was warmth, a fire burning steady, a light that would not go out. The 5 women, once sold as a joke, now stood as wives by choice and by strength. The rancher, once mocked as a fool, now carried a legacy none could deny. And the town of Dry Creek, once so eager to laugh, had been left instead with a tale they would never forget. The storm had passed, but its memory remained. And in that memory lay the truth, that even the cruelest of beginnings can give rise to something unbreakable, something worth remembering long after the laughter has died.